All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 89, Part 1, for release August 2nd, 2026. Slavery and Colonial Philadelphia. From the beginning of European settlement, colonial America relied heavily on people who were not fully free. Many arrived under contracts, apprenticeships, debt obligations, penal sentences, or other forms of bound service. Before 1775, more than 500,000 Europeans migrated to the 13 colonies. At least 10% were involuntary prisoners. Of roughly 450,000 voluntary European migrants, historian Christopher Tomlins estimates that about half of them arrived as indentured servants. Black history in the Philadelphia region reaches back to at least 1639. After William Penn founded Pennsylvania in 1681, and then Philadelphia became the colony's major port, the city entered Atlantic systems of migration, trade, servitude, and slavery. And the first known slave ship to arrive directly in Philadelphia came in 1684, when the Isabella brought enslaved Africans to the city. Philadelphia obviously was not a plantation city, but slavery still ran through its households, workshops, docks, political institutions, and founding-era symbols. Its history reminds us that slavery was not only southern and agricultural, it was also northern, urban, legal, commercial, and often in plain sight. The desperation to reach the New World was palpable for many poor Europeans. The price of a transatlantic crossing helped make bound labor common. Passage could cost as much as half a worker's annual wage. So many poor Europeans paid with years of labor. Indentures could be sold after arrival, and servants could be transferred from one master to another. Most of these were young. About 3/4 of them were under 25. Now, since legal adulthood for men was generally 24, older servants often served about 3 years, while younger servants could be bound longer. Indenture contracts turned passage into debt labor. Some migrants signed before they left Europe. Others had passage advanced by a merchant or ship captain, or were sold after arrival. Contracts usually lasted 3 to 7 years. During that time, servants could not freely quit, move, marry, or choose another employer. At the end, they were supposed to become free, sometimes receiving what was called freedom dues, such as clothing, tools, money, or even land. Indentured servitude was unevenly distributed. In English emigration registers from 1773 to 1776, indentured servants made up an exceptionally high share of recorded English emigrants bound for Virginia and Maryland, reported in some scholarship as about 96%. Between 1773 and 1776, 96% of the Europeans who settled in Virginia and Maryland were indentured servants. New England received very few indentured migrants by comparison. Labor-hungry regions relied on servitude. New England relied more on family migration, local labor, and different economic patterns. Apprenticeship was another form of controlled labor. It was usually tied to training in a craft, trade, or household skill, but it still restricted movement, wages, and independence. Philadelphia mayoral indenture records from 1771 to 1773 list apprentices, servants, and redemptioners, including German and other European migrants. Redemptioners crossed on credit and then sold a term of labor after arrival to repay passage. Unlike many indentured servants, they often did not know their master or their exact work until they reached the colonies. Think of Duffy's Cut. By the 1830s, Irish laborers arriving in Philadelphia could be met almost at the docks by contractors that offered immediate work on canals and railroads. The Duffy's Cut incident made that bargain brutally clear. 1832, 57 newly arrived Irish immigrant workers were hired for the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad and died near Malvern amid cholera, violence, and anti-Irish prejudice. Their deaths echoed an old axiom of American railroad building: there's a dead Irishman for every mile of railway. I talk about the whole Duffy's Cut incident in Biographical Bites from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, number 21. Some immigrant contracts named a trade or a line of work. Northern Irish and German migrants could combine passage repayment with trained or skilled service. Benjamin Franklin famously fled his apprenticeship to his brother James, a Boston printer, after years of conflict and strict control. Andrew Johnson, who was later president, escaped a tailor's apprenticeship. These stories show that unfree or semi-free labor was part of the broader colonial labor system, not limited to just enslaved Africans. Black Philadelphians also appear in apprenticeship and indenture records. Again, from 1771 to 1773, Philadelphia mayoral records include John Slower, described as a free Negro among those bound out. Pennsylvania Abolition Society records show how bondage could continue after manumission. Marie Rose Louis freed 15-year-old Fanny, but required her to serve until age 28. Peter Blight freed 13-year-old Frank, sent from Jamaica, but also kept him bound until age 28. For black children and youths, apprenticeship and indenture often extended racialized dependency, even as slavery supposedly declined. So Philadelphia became a mixed labor city. Enslaved Africans, white indentured servants, apprentices, free wage laborers, sailors, artisans, domestic workers, and dock workers often worked in overlapping spaces. Enslaved people labored in homes, shops, docks, warehouses, nearby farms, ships, taverns, and workshops. Enslavers also hired them out for days, months, or longer. This made slavery flexible, profitable, and mobile, but still controlled. By the early 1700s, slavery in Philadelphia had become explicitly race-based. Africans and people of African descent were treated as property. They were exposed to sale, punishment, forced labor, family separation, and surveillance. And by 1710, enslaved people made up nearly 1/5 of Philadelphia's population. By 1770, their number had grown to about 1,375, but their share had fallen to just over 8% because the city's total population had grown faster. That's right, 6 years before we declared our independence from Britain, there were 1,375 enslaved people living in the city where those papers were signed. The origins and roots of these enslaved people varied. Most enslaved people in colonial Philadelphia were African or African descended, but not all came directly from Africa. Some arrived through the Caribbean or other Atlantic ports after enslavement in places such as Barbados or Jamaica. Others came directly from Africa. But whatever the route, Philadelphia law defined them through enslavement. Philadelphia was tied to the larger Atlantic world. Ships carried goods, people, and profits among Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, and North America. Wealthy colonists, merchants, travelers, and officials would also bring their enslaved servants from other colonies. Philadelphia's slavery was urban and local, but deeply Atlantic. Daily life for an enslaved African in colonial Philadelphia was harsh, restricted, and especially uncertain. It differed from plantation slavery in the Chesapeake or the Deep South. Conditions depended on the enslaver, the work, and the setting. A home, workshop, tavern, dock, warehouse, ship, nearby farm. Urban slavery required movement through streets, markets, ports, and workplaces. That movement could allow news, relationships, worship, side work, or escape planning. But mobility was not the same as freedom. Punishment, sale, family separation, and forced labor remained constant threats. Still, enslaved Africans built family, religious, and community networks. Streets, churches, markets, docks, and workplaces brought enslaved people into contact with free black people, servants, sailors, and wage laborers. These networks helped people share information, preserve dignity, support one another, and resist slavery in ways official records often missed. Black churches strengthened those networks. Ministers such as Absalom Jones served communities that included both free black Philadelphians and people still living under slavery or long-term bondage. But it gave them places to worship, organize, learn, and support one another beyond direct white control. These churches taught spiritual equality and human dignity while building mutual aid, literacy, leadership, burial societies, anti-slavery organizing, and practical resistance. In Philadelphia and other northern cities, black religious communities cared for the poor and sick, protected vulnerable families, assisted freedom seekers, and challenged slavery and racial exclusion. Colonial Philadelphia held a deep contradiction. Pennsylvania had a strong Quaker presence and later became associated with anti-slavery activism. Yet many Quakers and other colonists enslaved people. The 1688 Germantown Petition against slavery was an earlier protest, but it did not end slavery. Philadelphia remained tied to slaveholding, slave trading, and slavery throughout the colonial period. A free black man in colonial or early republic Philadelphia had more legal independence than an enslaved black man, but his freedom was vulnerable. He could work for wages, he could attend church, visit family, rent lodging, join mutual aid networks, and build public ties. But he also faced racism, exclusion from many skilled jobs, constant surveillance, intimidation, and the ever-present danger of being mistaken for a fugitive or kidnapped into slavery. Freedom gave him more choices. It did not guarantee safety or equality. An enslaved black man moving through the same streets occupied a much more dangerous position. If he was sent on errands or hired out, working on the docks, carrying goods, moving between household and workplace, public presence obviously did not mean freedom. His movement depended on permission, custom, work assignments, and, of course, the ever-present white authorities. He could be questioned, watched, stopped, punished, sold, or accused of running away. Even when he knew the city well, his body and labor were legally controlled by someone else. So the difference was not simply who could walk the streets. It was what the law said about each man's body, labor, and future. A free black man could claim his own labor and build family, church, and community ties, but still moved under racial suspicion and kidnapping risk. An enslaved black man moved his property. A white indentured servant was also bound, but usually temporarily. Once his term ended, whiteness gave him a clearer path towards citizenship, voting, landholding, and public belonging than black freedom generally allowed. Resistance in Philadelphia usually appeared less as open rebellion than as daily refusal and survival. Slowdowns, feigned illness, broken tools, stolen food, ignored orders, work abandonment, and self-emancipation. Now, direct attacks did occur, often in response to beatings, threatened sale, escape attempts, extreme cruelty, or planned revolt. But never forget, the surviving records were written by enslavers or authorities, and they sometimes exaggerated these plots during periods of white fear while they ignored everyday resistance that never even reached the court. There's an old African proverb that is very appropriate for this, and that is, until the lion learns to write, every story will glorify the hunter. Large slave rebellions in British colonial Philadelphia appear to have been rare or even absent compared with New York or South Carolina or the Chesapeake. Philadelphia's enslaved population was usually dispersed among homes and shops and the docks and ships and warehouses and the small workplaces rather than being concentrated in plantation gangs. That urban dispersal, combined with surveillance and punishment, made large-scale revolt difficult, even though enslavers still feared it. Across colonial British North America, organized rebellions and conspiracies were far less common than everyday resistance, but enslavers treated them as terrifying possibilities. Major examples include New York slave riot of 1712, the Stono Rebellion of 1739, and the New York conspiracy trials of 1741. Historians have identified at least 250 and as many as 311 uprisings or alleged uprisings across the United States and colonial history, although that total includes rumors, conspiracies, confirmed rebellions, and later 19th century events. And, of course, almost all of the historians were white. Slavery and indentured servitude both limited freedom and supplied labor for Philadelphia's economy. Enslaved people and indentured servants worked in these various places. Both could be controlled, punished, transferred, or hired out in certain circumstances. Both were tied to migration, trade, and the Atlantic economy. But the differences were profound. Indentured servitude, temporary, contract-based, fixed term, 3, 4, 5 years, followed by expected freedom and sometimes freedom dues. Slavery, lifelong. Enslaved people did not gain freedom simply by completing a term of labor. Legal status was another divide. Indentured servants were bound, but not usually treated as property in the same complete sense. Enslaved people could be bought, sold, inherited, mortgaged, hired out, and separated from family. Over time, slavery in Philadelphia became racialized and hereditary, meaning children born to enslaved mothers could also be enslaved, or, after Pennsylvania's gradual abolition law, bound to long terms of service. And race became the central dividing line. Many indentured servants were European migrants, Britain, Ireland, Germany, elsewhere. I will talk about some of the Germans in another section. Enslaved people in Philadelphia, mostly Africans, people of African descent, although Native Americans were also enslaved in some cases. But by the 18th century, racist ideas increasingly cast black people as permanently enslavable and European servants as temporarily bound future free people. Pennsylvania's 1780 Gradual Abolition Act did not immediately free enslaved people already held in the state. It banned further importation, required enslavers to register the people they enslaved, and declared that children born in Philadelphia after the law would become legally free only after serving until age 28. So abolition unfolded slowly. Existing slavery continued, and many future black children became long-term bound laborers instead of immediately free citizens. In the 1780s, Philadelphia also faced a fugitive slave crisis. Roughly 50% to 75% of young enslaved men in the city ran away from their masters. And by 1810, despite various loopholes and evasions, it looked like there were only 2 enslaved people remaining in the city of Philadelphia. Now, these laws also threatened non-resident enslavers. Enslaved people held by them could claim freedom after 6 months of continuous residence in Pennsylvania. In the 1790s, while Philadelphia served as the temporary national capital, George Washington brought enslaved people from Mount Vernon to the president's house near 6th and Market Streets. To avoid the 6-month rule, His household rotated enslaved workers out of Pennsylvania before they could establish continuous residence, and then he brought them back. The law challenged slavery, but powerful enslavers could still maneuver around it. Freedom at age 28 was not a minor delay or a minor inconvenience. In a world with high infant mortality, disease, dangerous labor, poor nutrition, and racial violence, many enslaved African Americans never reached that age. Gradual abolition forced black children to spend their most formative and economically valuable years in bondage before they received the freedom that white society claimed to recognize. Later estimates place enslaved life expectancy at birth at only about 21 or 22 years, with mortality especially severe among African-born captives in their first years after arrival. The broader point is simple. Early America was built by people whose labor was constrained. Some were enslaved for life. Some were indentured for years. Some were transported as prisoners. Some were bound as apprentices. And some were born into legal categories, but delayed freedom for decades. Philadelphia's economy rested on this mixed labor system, but slavery remained the most severe and racialized form because it denied personhood. It made labor hereditary, and it exposed people to sale, violence, and permanent dispossession. So colonial Philadelphia shows both the breadth of unfree labor and the hierarchy within it. Many settlers and workers lived under contracts or obligations, but enslaved black people faced racial ownership. A free black man and an enslaved black man, white, might walk the same streets. One moved with limited legal independence, the other moved by permission, under surveillance, and under constant threat. The street was shared, the meaning of movement was not. Philadelphia's position on slavery was deeply tangled. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the city was known for abolitionist organizing, Quaker anti-slavery activism, and a growing free black community. Yet it stayed commercially connected to slavery through shipping, banking, insurance, manufacturing, Southern credit, and trade in slave-grown commodities. Many white Philadelphians accepted gradual abolition at home while avoiding direct confrontation with Southern slavery. The city could condemn slavery morally while profiting from the systems that slavery sustained. Two men, often identified among the largest enslavers in American history, also had strong Philadelphia connections. Pierce Butler, who married into the Wister family, and somebody you might not have heard of before, Stephen Duncan. He's buried at Laurel Hill East, and he will come up later in this podcast. Of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence, 41 owned enslaved people at some point, depending on how historians define ownership and what records survive. Philadelphia hosted a Congress in which many delegates benefited from slavery, even as they debated liberty and independence. Some delegates brought their enslaved servants with them. The best documented example, Thomas Jefferson, arrived in Philadelphia May 1776 with Robert Hemings, a 14-year-old enslaved valet. Robert was an older half-brother to Sally Hemings. A precise total for how many enslaved people were brought by all Declaration signers is hard to establish. But we know very well about George Washington's enslavement of Africans. The modern controversy over George Washington's Philadelphia household centers on the president's house site near 6th and Market Street. That's where Washington lived while Philadelphia was the temporary national capital. Its proximity to the Liberty Bell forces visitors to face the contradiction between national liberty and Washington's use of enslaved labor in the same symbolic landscape. The exhibit, it's called The President's House, Freedom and Slavery in the Making of a New Nation, opened in 2010 after years of advocacy and research. It interpreted the lives of 9 enslaved people Washington held there: Austin, Christopher Shields, Giles, Hercules, Joe Richardson, Moll, Oney Judge, Paris, and Richmond. And it placed them within the broader history of slavery, freedom, and the founding era. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of dedications to George Washington around this country. This was an opportunity to use George Washington to teach about something else. A central force behind this site was the Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, ATAC. It was founded and led by Philadelphia attorney and civil rights activist Michael Cord. ATAC argued that the nation's first presidential residence could not be interpreted honestly without naming and memorializing the enslaved people who lived and labored there. The coalition organized public pressure, petitions, rallies, historical education, and legal advocacy. And according to Penn Carey Law's Advocacy for Racial and Civil Justice Clinic, Cord delivered a petition with 15,000 signatures in 2002 demanding that Independence Park acknowledge the enslaved people connected to the site. ATAC later helped lead what supporters described as the first slavery memorial on federal land in the United States. This controversy intensified in January 2026 when the National Park Service removed interpretive panels from the outdoor exhibit after a federal directive that targeted materials said to, quote, inappropriately disparage, end quote, Americans. Local officials, historians, tour guides, faith leaders, and activists condemned this removal as erasure of black history. ATAC organized rallies and public campaigns, demanded restoration, framed the dispute not as a wording fight, but as a struggle over slavery would remain visible at one of the country's most visited founding-era sites. The city of Philadelphia sued the Department of the Interior, the National Park Service, and federal officials. The city argued that removal violated its rights under a 2006 cooperative agreement through which it had helped develop and fund the exhibit. And in February 2026, U.S. District Judge Cynthia M. Roof sided with the city at the preliminary stage and ordered the federal government to restore the removed material and make no further changes without the city's written agreement. The ruling treated this exhibit as a jointly created public installation whose removal could cause irreparable harm to the city's civic and historical interests. The federal government appealed, and on June 18, 2026, a unanimous Third Circuit panel vacated the injunction and ruled that Philadelphia did not have statutory property or contractual rights allowing it to control National Park Service exhibit content at the president's house. The court said standing to sue did not mean the city's contract claims were likely to succeed. It also described the proposed replacement panels as providing historical context and acknowledging the evil, injustices, and hypocrisies of slavery. On July 3rd, the Third Circuit cleared the way for the federal government to install the replacement panels, and on July 8th, the city petitioned the court to rehear that decision. July 13th, 2026, U.S. District Judge Cynthia M. Roof dismissed 4 of the city's 5 claims for lack of jurisdiction following the Third Circuit mandate, while allowing one breach of agreement claim to proceed. Critics, including ATAC and historians who supported the original exhibit, saw the rulings as a setback. They argued that the replacement material softened the site's emphasis on slavery and reduced attention to the enslaved people themselves. ATAC called the changes a revision rather than a restoration. The legal fight reflects a deeper conflict in Philadelphia's public memory. How to celebrate liberty while confronting enslaved labor at the country's founding spaces. I'm dictating this on July 17th. That's a Friday. Overnight on Tuesday, July 14th, 2026, the United States Park Service replaced the long-standing explanation of the horrors of slavery with a bland interpretation of the lives of enslaved people. What has been softened is not merely the wording, but the moral truth. Enslaved people did not simply live and work at the president's house. They were held there, they were used there, watched there, and denied the freedom that was being celebrated around them. The Avenging the Ancestors Coalition objects that the new president's house signs do not simply revise history, they dilute it. The new language softens the lives of the enslaved by making captivity sound like residence. Forced labor sounds like service. Moral violence sounds like historical complexity. By softening the language of slavery, it shifts attention from the enslaved people to the presidency, and it presents George Washington much more gently than the facts warrant. The new exhibit turns a memorial to truth into a lesson in evasion. As a 79-year-old white man, an amateur student of American history, I am disgusted with this turn of events. But I can't identify with them personally. I cannot know exactly what it would feel like to stand in the place of a black American or an immigrant and watch this history be erased. I imagine it reopens some wounds. I'm pretty sure that I would feel grief and anger and warning all at once. Anger that the suffering and the labor of enslaved people could still be treated as an inconvenience to the national story. Grief that the truth has to be defended again and again. And warning that when a country begins deciding whose history may be remembered, it is also deciding whose humanity may be ignored. To see this happening at the president's house in Philadelphia, a place where the ideals of liberty stood beside the reality of bondage, would feel like more than neglect. This feels like a deliberate narrowing of America's memory, and a message that some people's place in that memory remains conditional. This is a developing story. William Faulkner said it best in his 1951 novel, Requiem for a Nun. The past is never dead. It's not even past.